The last known photo of Szilárd Suhajda was taken by a passing climber at 8,400 meters. It shows an exhausted man sitting among a scatter of discarded oxygen canisters. A few hours later, he would stop responding to voices. A day later, he would be found alive near the summit of Everest, but no one could reach him. Another day after that, 3 of the world's best Sherpas would search every meter of the ridge, and they would find nothing. No body, no trace. Everest had taken him whole. To understand how he ended up here, we have to go back to the small Hungarian town of Szaba. It was here, in 1982, far from any serious mountains, that a boy named Szilárd Suhajda was born. Mountains came into his life through his grandfather. It was with him that he first spent a night in a tent, hiked the trails, and learned to read the terrain. During his school years, he spent every summer at hiking camps, and at home, he devoured books about the great alpinists, Reinhold Messner, Emil Zsigmondy, István Benedek. For now, other people's ascents would have to stand in for his own. After his studies, he became an English teacher and moved to Esztergom, where he joined the local mountaineering club, the Carpathians, Transylvania, the Alps. He was gaining experience and altitude. In 2007, he summited Mont Blanc, and that climb to 4,800 meters changed everything. Suhajda decided that mountains were no longer just a hobby. Just a few months later, in the winter of 2008, he and his friend Csabi Kostan were caught in an avalanche in the Austrian Alps. They both survived, but for the first time, Suhajda understood that mountains weren't just dangerous for the heroes in his books. Then he did something few would dare. In 2010, he quit his stable job as a teacher and moved to Brighton, England, not for a career, but to earn money for his first Himalayan expedition. For 2 years, he worked 7 days a week, saving every pound. He bought his down jacket for the climb, secondhand on eBay. There was simply no budget for a new one. In 2012, he finally made it to the Karakoram. He attempted Gasherbrum 1 and 2, but failed. He returned to England and threw himself back into working overtime for another 2 years. In 2014, he was back in the Himalayas, and this time, he summited Broad Peak, 8,051 meters without supplemental oxygen. It was his first 8,000er, and it proved a point. The English teacher from Szaba could breathe where the air has all but vanished. By 2015, he was standing at the foot of K2, the world's second highest peak, 8,611 meters, a mountain with a reputation as the most dangerous of all the 8,000ers. The climb was cut short at 7,400 meters. The avalanche risk was too high, and Suhajda turned back. In 2016, he returned to K2 as part of the Johnny Walker K2 expedition. Another failure, 2 attempts, 0 summits, and a mountain that, for now, was stronger than him. By this point, Suhajda had a regular climbing partner, David Klein. Klein was older, more experienced, and harder on himself. He was the first Hungarian to summit Annapurna, statistically the most dangerous of the 8,000ers. Yet, Klein called himself a conservative climber, stating plainly that danger, for him, is no spice added to the game. Klein had his reasons. In 2010, a collapsing ice wall had buried him and a friend. Klein survived. His friend did not. Together, he and Suhajda formed a team called Esemeni Horizont, Event Horizon. The name, when you think about it, sounds like a warning. In physics, an event horizon is the boundary beyond which nothing can ever return. In 2016, the partners announced the first ever Hungarian attempt to climb Everest without supplemental oxygen. The expedition began in the spring of 2017. Both men funded the entire thing themselves. Suhajda began the ascent, but at Camp 2, around 6,400 meters, he developed severe stomach problems. He retreated from 7,900 meters and spent the next 3 weeks recovering at base camp. By the end of the expedition, he had lost 15 kilograms. 2018 brought another attempt in the Karakoram. Gasherbrum 1 and 2, no oxygen, no porters. Bad weather shut down both mountains. He went home empty-handed again. By now, Suhajda had 4 consecutive years without a single successful 8,000er summit. The Hungarian press and the climbing community started asking questions. The criticism wasn't malicious, but it was persistent. Maybe it's time to stop? Maybe Broad Peak was his limit? For a man who had given up his job, his country, and his stability for the mountains, These questions hit a raw nerve, but Suhajda didn't back down. He prepared for a third attempt on K2, set for 2019. In the summer of 2019, the Ezemeni Horizont expedition was once again at the foot of K2. That season, there were 120 climbers from 10 different teams on the mountain, and the Sherpas brought worrying news. Deep snow near the summit, difficult conditions. Some were saying it might be a no-summit year. Of the 120 climbers, only 31 would ultimately reach the top. After 3 acclimatization rotations, Klein and Suhajda began their summit push. They climbed together to Camp 2 at 6,700 meters, then to Camp 3 at 7,300. And here, Klein made a decision that would later be called the most powerful act of the entire expedition. He was having stomach problems, the same kind that had plagued Suhajda on Everest 2 years earlier. Klein knew that if he continued, he would slow his partner down, and maybe ruin the entire attempt. He turned around and descended to base camp, but he didn't leave. He sat down by the radio. Suhajda continued alone. From Camp 4, he entered the zone where the air holds only a third of its normal oxygen. No bottle, no Sherpa, no partner on the rope. Above 8,500 meters, his speed dropped to just 34 meters per hour. Every 5 steps, he would stop, drop his head to his knees, and fall asleep. Not rest, sleep, instantaneous and dangerous. At that altitude, to fall asleep is to risk never waking up. And this is where Klein's voice on the radio made all the difference. He wouldn't let Suhajda black out. He talked to him, guided him, kept him conscious. 2 men, one on the mountain, the other in a tent 4 kilometers below. Together, they pulled through those final meters. 15 hours from Camp 4 to the summit. Suhajda spent 30 minutes on the peak of K2. He was the first Hungarian ever to stand on the world's second highest summit. Without oxygen, without Sherpas, after 2 failed attempts and 4 years of criticism. From the top, he radioed Klein. "I'm on the summit of K2. The sky is clear, I can see everything. The view from the ridge is beautiful. I hope next time we'll be standing on a beautiful summit together." Klein would later say at a press conference in Islamabad, "I am proud of my decision. I couldn't live with myself if the expedition failed because of me." K2 changed everything. Suhajda returned to Hungary a different man, not a teacher who climbs mountains, but a professional mountaineer. He left teaching for good and dedicated himself entirely to expeditions, lectures, and guiding. The critics fell silent. Sponsors started to appear. The country knew his name. But there was a detail that seemed insignificant in the moment of triumph, but would later mean so much. On K2, Klein was right there with Suhajda, not physically, but on the radio. The man who wouldn't let him fall asleep. The man who kept him tethered to consciousness. The next time Suhajda found himself on that same edge, that voice on the radio would be gone. Klein's voice had saved Suhajda on K2, but after that triumph, their paths began to diverge, not because of a conflict, but because K2 had done different things to each of them. Suhajda saw that he could reach the summit of an 8,000er alone. Klein saw that he knew when to turn back. Both had received confirmation of who they were, and those 2 answers pointed in different directions. In 2021, they attempted Dhaulagiri 1 together, their last joint expedition. Bad weather stopped them at 7,600 meters. Another mountain, another retreat, another descent empty-handed. But this time, the failure caused no criticism, no drama. It simply marked an end. By the beginning of 2022, Suhajda announced that the Ezemeni Horizont project was over. The partnership with Klein, which had lasted for years and included 6 joint 8,000er expeditions without oxygen, was closed. His new path was one of maximum purity. No partner, no Sherpas, no oxygen, no porters. In January of 2022, Suhajda announced a project he called the Big Five, the 5 highest peaks on the planet. K2 was already done. That left Everest, Kangchenjunga, Lhotse, and Makalu. He intended to climb each one solo and without oxygen. The first test of this new style was Lhotse, 8,516 meters, the 4th highest peak in the world. In May of 2022, Suhajda climbed it alone. Above base camp, there wasn't a single person working for him. He carried his own tent, food, and stove. He set his own camps. He chose his own tactics. His only assistance came from the fixed ropes on the standard route, set by Sherpas for everyone on that path. Everything else was just him. Lhotse surrendered on his first attempt. Suhajda became the third Hungarian to stand on its summit. It was a success, but there was a seed in that success, one that would sprout a year later. On K2, at the critical moment, when he was collapsing to his knees and falling asleep every 5 steps, Klein's voice was there, keeping him awake. On Lhotse, that voice was gone. Silence was now his primary tool. The next peak was Everest. And on Everest, that same silence would become not a tool, but a trap. By this point, Suhajda had a family. He also had a context he knew better than anyone. In 27 years, not a single Hungarian had managed to climb Everest without oxygen. 16 attempts, 16 failures. The 17th attempt began in the spring of 2023 under the name Kyotera Everest Expedition for its title sponsor. Suhajda flew to Kathmandu, trekked to base camp, and walked into a situation no one had expected. Among the hundreds of climbers living side by side in tents at 5,300 meters, a respiratory virus was spreading. Coughing, fever, chills. The camp sounded like a hospital ward. One by one, those who had planned to climb without oxygen were abandoning their attempts. By the time Suhajda set out, the only person to summit without oxygen that season was a Pakistani climber, Sajid Saad Para, and even he had arrived on Everest already acclimatized from Annapurna. Suhajda was sick too. A deep cough, watery eyes, symptoms that would mean a week in bed at sea level, but at 8,000 meters could be a sign of pulmonary edema. Still, he wasn't backing down. He didn't even take emergency oxygen as a matter of principle, just like on all his previous climbs. The company's 7 summit treks handled his base camp logistics, but above that, Suhajda was completely on his own. Tent, food, stove, fuel, everything on his back. At 8,000 meters, without oxygen, even the simple act of melting snow for a cup of water is a monumental test of will. The night before he left, he wrote in his expedition journal he was scared and excited at the same time, eager to start the climb, and just as eager to return home. On May 21st, Suhajda left base camp. The plan was to move up 1 camp per day, conservative and calculated. The summit push was scheduled for May 24th. For 3 days, he climbed exactly on schedule. Camp 1, Camp 2, Camp 3, South Colonel. Every evening, he pitched his own tent, melted his own snow, woke up, and packed up camp, all by himself. On the night of May 23rd, heading into the 24th, he left Camp 4 at 7,950 meters and began his final assault. Above him, only darkness, the wind, and 2 vertical kilometers of mountain reaching for the sky. Somewhere on the same route that night, other people were also moving, all of them with oxygen, with a team, as part of a standard commercial expedition. Suhajda was following the same path, using the same fixed ropes, but under completely different circumstances. Those who had summited during the night were already on their way down, passing him. Around 7:30 in the morning, one of them, Ben Ferrer from the 7 Summit Climbs team, spotted a man sitting on a ledge climbers call the balcony. It's a flat section at 8,400 meters from where the route climbs steeply towards the south summit, and then on to the Hillary Step and the peak. Scattered around the sitting man were empty oxygen bottles, discarded by other climbers. It was Suhajda. Ferrer recognized him. They had spoken at base camp. He walked over, said hello, and asked, "How's it going?" Suhajda replied with a single word, "Okay." Then he asked what the altitude was. Ferrer told him, 8,400. Suhajda looked tired, and Ferrer assumed the Hungarian was probably radioing his team his turnaround point, that he was stopping here and heading down. The thought made sense. A man without oxygen, clearly exhausted, sitting among a graveyard of empty bottles at an altitude where most people, even with oxygen, are at their limit. Ferrer took out his camera and snapped a picture. He didn't know that this photo would be the last image the world would ever see of a living Szilárd Suhajda. At 7:45, 15 minutes after meeting Ferrer, Suhajda contacted his home team on his satellite phone. His voice was calm. He reported that he was feeling good and the weather was favorable. This would be the last time he spoke to his team in a clear, human way, with full sentences, an assessment of the situation, with information they could trust. Everything that followed would be just fragments, GPS pings, and the accounts of strangers who saw him from a distance. Suhajda stood up and continued his ascent, but he was moving very, very slowly. The balcony is at 8,400 meters. The south summit is at 8,750. That's 350 vertical meters, but the route is a steep, broken, wind-blasted ridge with sections of rock and ice. With oxygen, this section takes 3 to 4 hours. Without oxygen, significantly longer. But to take 6 hours and barely make a dent in it, that's not just longer, that's a warning sign. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, Nepal time, a Canadian climber descending the route encountered Suhajda. He was above the balcony, but not by much. In 6 hours of climbing, he had made almost no progress. They knew each other. They'd crossed paths earlier that night, around 4:30 in the morning, when both were heading up. Back then, they were both on the move. Now, the difference between them was stark. The Canadian was descending because he had assessed the situation and made a decision. Suhajda was still ascending because he hadn't made one at all. Another 2+ hours passed. After 4 in the afternoon, the Canadian saw Suhajda for the last time. The Hungarian was about 20 meters below the south summit. He was on his feet and still moving up. The Canadian tried to talk to him. Suhajda didn't answer. He didn't turn, didn't react, didn't stop. He just kept moving, slowly but relentlessly, step by step, upward. The Canadian would later describe him with a single phrase, a determined man cut from a different cloth. But in the moment he saw it, admiration wasn't his primary feeling. His primary feeling was the dawning realization of what was happening. The time was after 4 in the afternoon. This was catastrophically late. Most climbers begin their summit, push between midnight and 2 in the morning to reach the top by dawn and have enough daylight to get down. By 4 in the afternoon, Suhajda hadn't even reached the south summit, which isn't even the main peak, but an intermediate point before the Hillary Step and the final ridge. Even if he made it to the summit, his descent would be at night, in the dark, in the wind, with no oxygen, no Sherpa, no partner. The weather, which had been favorable that morning, was starting to turn. The wind was picking up. It was getting dark. And still, Suhajda did not turn around. He kept going up. Without a voice on the radio, without responding to calls, without reacting to the obvious fact that everyone else around him was already heading down. His GPS tracker, which had been working intermittently, sent out 2 final signals. The first, 8,720 meters. The second, 8,795 meters, which corresponds to the altitude of the Hillary Step. This second signal came late at night. It meant that Suhajda had continued climbing in the dark, alone, without oxygen, into worsening weather. After that signal, silence. No GPS, no sat phone, no radio, nothing. The silence lasted all night and through the next morning. His home team in Hungary stayed awake, refreshing screens, waiting for a signal that never came. On May 25th, when hope was already turning into grim arithmetic, how many hours without shelter, without oxygen, at -30 degrees, news arrived, not from Suhajda, from strangers on a distant mountain. The Imagine Nepal team, on their way to the summit, found a man at the base of the Hillary Step, at an altitude of approximately 8,780 meters. They identified him by his clothing. The jacket bore the logos of his expedition sponsor, Kyocera. He was showing signs of life, but what the Sherpas saw left no room for illusion. Frostbite and symptoms of high-altitude cerebral edema, a condition where the brain swells from lack of oxygen, causing a person to lose coordination, consciousness, and the ability to understand where they are or what's happening to them. And here, the tragedy gains a second, perhaps most terrible layer. Suhajda was alive, he was seen, he was identified, but helping him was impossible. He was lying away from the fixed ropes, off the main route. The Imagine Nepal Sherpas were, at that moment, escorting an extremely weakened client down the mountain, a Chinese climber who could barely stand on his own. To reach Suhajda without a safety line, across a rocky face at nearly 9 kilometers, would almost certainly mean dying themselves. They had to pass him by. Whether anyone else saw him that day is unknown. On the evening of May 25th, the home team coordinated a rescue plan with 7 summit treks. On the morning of the 26th, a helicopter would be sent for aerial reconnaissance. Simultaneously, 3 Sherpas would head up towards the Hillary Steppe. The best-case scenario, they would reach him on the night of the 27th. Suhajda's wife, Timea Legindi, published a message in which she recounted the facts and added one sentence that silenced everyone. Realistically, the chances of finding him alive at this altitude are very slim. The attempt began on the morning of May 26th. The Italian climber and helicopter pilot Simone Moro flew his machine up from Kathmandu. On board were 3 Sherpas. And these weren't just any 3 men with high-altitude experience. These were the elite. Among them was Gelje Sherpa, one of the men who, in January of 2021, made the first winter ascent of K2, an event the climbing world considers one of the last great achievements in Himalayan mountaineering. If anyone was capable of working at nearly 9,000 meters in extreme conditions, it was these men. Moro dropped the team directly at Camp 2, at 6,400 meters, bypassing the multi-day trek through the Khumbu icefall that standard expeditions take days to complete. He then left to conduct a reconnaissance flight of the south face, scanning everything visible from the air, looking for signs of a fall, a body on the slope, any sign at all. He found nothing. This was both bad and good news. Suhajda hadn't fallen down the south face, which meant he was possibly still up there, near the Hillary Steppe. Possibly. At 10 in the morning, Nepal time, the 3 Sherpas set out from Camp 2. What happened next was a feat in itself, one that is rarely written about because it occurred in the shadow of the main tragedy. In 7 hours, they climbed from 6,400 meters to 7,950 meters, all the way to Camp 4 on the South Col. For a normal climber, this section takes 2 days with an overnight stop. These 3 did it in a single day's push, at 3 times the standard pace. At Camp 4, a 4th Sherpa and an assistant were waiting for them with a tent, food, and hot drinks, a short rest. But the rest lasted only 2 hours. At 7:15 in the evening, as the wind died down, the team of 3 headed up, into the night, into the darkness, onto the ridge between the South Col and the summit. The 4th Sherpa followed later. They climbed all night, along the same route Suhajda had taken 2 days earlier, past the balcony where Ferrer took the last photo, past the spot where the Canadian climber had tried to speak to a man who wouldn't answer, up toward the south summit and beyond, to the Hillary Steppe. At dawn on May 27th, the rescuers reached the Hillary Steppe, the very spot where the Imagine Nepal team had seen Suhajda alive 36 hours earlier. He wasn't there. A systematic search began, methodical, professional, desperate. The 3 Sherpas climbed from the Hillary Steppe all the way to the summit, 8,848 meters, and then made their way back down. They scanned every possible fall line, to the right and left of the main route, on both the Nepalese and Tibetan sides, pushing as far from the fixed ropes as safety will allow. They descended below the Hillary Steppe, toward the south summit, scouring the slopes, peering over every crest. Hours of work at this extreme altitude, and nothing. No body, no gear, no tracks, not even a shred of fabric. The man seen alive right here just a day and a half ago has vanished without a trace. The rescuers got in touch with his home team in Hungary. Together, they made the call. The search was over. The conditions, time, weather, the terrain itself left no chance of finding Suhajda alive, and to keep risking the lives of the rescuers at an altitude where the very air was trying to kill you. It was just not possible. The priority now was getting the 3 of them down safely. On May 28th, they made one last attempt. A helicopter did a final sweep of the face above Camp 2. Again, nothing. Separately, at 6,500 meters, a Sherpa found some of Suhajda's belongings, a jacket and a tent, still bearing his sponsor's logos. The gear he'd left behind on his way up, traveling light for the summit push. His things made it back. The man did not. And now, someone has to say it out loud. A message from the home team appears on Suhajda's official social media page. The wording is precise, clinical. Every word chosen to leave no room for false hope. Despite the superhuman efforts of a search team comprised of the best Nepalese mountain guides, Szilárd Suhajda has not been found on Everest. They spent hours searching the wider area of the Hillary Steppe, where the climber was last seen alive. The Sherpas ascended and descended multiple times between 8,750 meters and the summit at 8,848 meters, looking for any trace of Suhajda, to no avail. Given the time that has passed, the weather, and the terrain conditions, there is no longer any chance of finding the climber alive. The ground search has been called off. And superhuman efforts isn't just a figure of speech. In just a day and a half, 3 Sherpas traveled from Kathmandu all the way to the summit of Everest and back. They searched every meter of that ridge, at an altitude where the human body simply dies just by existing, and they found nothing. The mountain had taken him completely, without a trace, without an explanation, without a body to identify, to mourn, to bury. The 2023 season would become one of the deadliest in Everest's history. At least 12 confirmed dead, and another 5 missing, a statistic that now included Szilárd Suhajda's name, as its final entry. In the entire history of the mountain, less than 2% of all successful Everest summits have been made without supplemental oxygen. Without the support of Sherpas, even fewer. Szilárd Suhajda is now one of the roughly 200 climbers whose bodies remain on Everest. An English teacher from Békés Saba, who bought his jacket on eBay and worked 7 days a week to fund his dream, the first Hungarian to summit K2. A man who, at 8,500 meters, would fall asleep every 5 steps, and still push on, because he could hear his friend's voice on the radio. On Everest, that voice wasn't there. There was only the silence he had chosen for himself, and in that silence, he was gone. In 2024, Sherpas are planning a massive cleanup operation to remove bodies from Everest. Over the decades, the mountain has become a high-altitude graveyard, where the dead now serve as landmarks along the route. Suhajda's wife, Timea Legindi, has made a public plea. If her husband's body is ever found, leave it on the mountain. Don't bring him down, don't bring him back. Let him rest where he remained.